great to see Sangha coming together. Particularly, to remember Bhante. I needed to apologise first because I said it was 5 years ago. Actually, it's 6 years ago. Time flies. Anyway, and thank you. I'll start by thanking Lee and Miriam for this shine. Yeah, no, it's really good to think coming together on this basis. And what Abhijata said a little bit about how good that is, and why we do that. I was thinking a little bit about that. Why do we come together? And I think there's lots of reasons really. It's lovely just to be with the order, with the Mitras Sangha. And there's something special, I feel, about evoking Bhante, not just self, but in this collective way. Something different emerges, as it were. And I don't know about you, but lots of memories come back from my direct contact with Bhante and through his books, lectures, through all those different ways. And it just really reminds me, I can so easily take my life and the benefits I have in my life for granted. But so much of the meaning, the significance, the friendship, all the benefits I have in my life are due to Bhante starting a movement, which I encountered. So just firstly, I think evoking Bhante, remembering him, brings forth that gratitude, certainly in me. And I think that's really important. A couple of other things. I think I'm still trying to work out who Bhante was. I don't think I'm going to get there. He's a complex, multifaceted, unfathomable being. But through various ways, including Nagabodhi's fantastic book, The Boy, the Monk, the Man. I'm always finding new dimensions or new aspects or new things about Bhante. And also his teachings. You read a book again and you notice things that you didn't notice before. So there's always new things emerging. And the other thing I was thinking about is, well, an event like this sort of reminds us, well, at least for me, is my relationship, and I think our relationship to Bhante isn't something static. It's not like, okay, he died, it's fixed. It's still unfolding, it's still emerging, it's still evolving, it's still developing. I think that will carry on for some time. So events like this are ways of that unfolding happening deeper, that deepening, and also I would say maturing. We are a Sangha which is still very young and still developing. Our maturing relationship with Bhante, I think, is part of that. So I could go on about the benefits of this, but I really want to move on and just to introduce Nagabodhi a little bit. You all know Nagabodhi very well, but well, maybe not all of you do actually. But I'm really delighted to have you in Nagabodhi. Very special. It's been a little while since seeing you. But Nagabodhi is an ideal person to help us to bring to mind Bhante. So a few figures. So 1970 was when you first encountered the movement. You were ordained in 74?
January 74.
So you've had your 5th year, is that right? Order. I mean, that's amazing. So we'll late. It's a bit late now.
About halfway through.
Yeah. And of course, you've known Bhante over 50 years. So over 50 years, over a good bit over 50 years of Bhante as well. Sorry, over half. And in that time, you had a lot of contact with Bhante, and you've seen the development from just like a few friends in a way, gathering together with Bhante. That was the order, a few friends, far less than in this group. Now, right through to after a bit of immersion into Triratna and into an international movement. So I was thinking, not only have you observed or keenly observed what's happening during that time. You know, you've been there, participating, instrumental in it. To which we have you've been involved with. Well, did you found? Is it like you founded?
Yes, I mean, I registered it as a charity and gave it its name. It was a subcommittee of the FWBO, which was still is the only. There is one charity called Friends of Western Buddhism. It might have been renamed, but it met at Pundarika, our first centre in North London, and so we discussed just the centre business, and part of that was getting some stuff printed. And I left the job, and that then turned into
I was also thinking, as well as those sort of institutional responsibilities, I know you've been a really great friend, I know you were also with Windhorse Trust, and it was really great. Of the Windhorse Trust. But lastly, I suppose I just want to draw out, and this not only participated and observed, but I think I look to you in the point. You always have a really good angle on things. I think you're able to look upon the movement from different perspectives, maybe even how we're seen from outside as well as within inside. And I've really appreciated that key, sometimes in a way slightly independent perspective and view of things. I think that also comes out in your fantastic work. So I'm really glad you're here. I have to say, I wonder sometimes what would happen if you stayed in the BBC. Maybe you would have become an alcoholic. I think this morning with it. Maybe you could be seeing the movement of the brand. Okay, well, let's fire away. I can say more, but let's fire away with some questions. Yeah, I suppose one of the things I'd be interested in is you were here, right? You were involved with the movement right at the beginning. Well, not right, almost. I'd be interested to start just saying, maybe you could say a bit about what were your first impressions of Bhante? Where did you encounter him, and what was happening for you at that time? What was it like?
Okay. Just hello. I'm just aware that 6 years is quite a long time, and there could be people in this room who have become Mitras, having got involved with Triratna since Bhante died. Yeah. So I'm sort of assuming that there are people who kind of know very little and have, when probably even wonder, why should we celebrate and who was it? So I just want to mark that. And I guess, well, your experience probably wouldn't be like mine. Maybe it would on your first visit, but on my first visit, there were probably about 30 people in that hired room. Sangharakshita was giving a lecture on the jewel in the lotus. Very, very good talk. It's on Free Buddhist Audio. He wore robes, but had I arrived earlier, he would have arrived in his civvies and would have probably changed into his robes. He just wore for those sorts of occasions. He had the long hair, the rings, all that stuff. There was no obvious sign of an order. In fact, I'd been involved for maybe a year before I even realized there was an order. I mean, there were people who'd been ordained, but already by 1970, some of them had faded away. I guess maybe there'd been, by then, maybe 20 people ordained. And if I think back, maybe only 7 or 8 of them were at all active or regularly involved. So basically, it was this rather strange man in a room, in a a hired space in Notting Hill, giving a talk about the White Lotus, a talk in a series about the White Lotus Sutra. My background was that I'd had a kind of mystical, religious, no self, whatever you want to call it, experience while at university. Not drug related. They came later. The experience came first, but I'd sort of been reading around and had honed in on Buddhism as the thing that most closely spoke in a language that resonated with my experience. And so I was calling myself a Buddhist, but I really strongly didn't believe in groups or teachers. And it was a colleague at work, and a BBC film cutting room. You know what film is? Some of you probably don't know. But celluloid, plastic, hundreds of tin. My colleague in one of these cutting rooms was a follower of Sangharakshita, who lent me a tape of the Tibetan Buddha Dead and his talk on that, I think it was, and just nagged and nagged and nagged that I should meet his teacher, which I went to that lecture out of politeness. I wasn't immediately a follower, and Sangharakshita's talk, and I've written about this, I think, in my book or in Jai Bhim, the early book I wrote. He was a strange apparition, you know, this middle-aged man with a sort of strange amalgam of robes and his, you know, thick pullover and the rings and the hair and the heavy glasses and a rather distant manner. It wasn't immediately attractive, but when he started to talk, and I'd say this is something that I found characteristic of him, he was so easily himself. You know, he wasn't a monk who floated or was incredibly tantric. He just seemed to be really engaged in his theme and relaxed in his skin as he began the lecture talking about a caravan making its way across the Tibetan plateau with lamas and bodyguards and brigands coming and raiding the caravan. And so the talk began, and then he moves into the meaning of Om Mani Padme Hum by the way he does, just drawing you into the story with images, with richness, with color, and just gradually unfolding the meaning. I was very, very impressed by the talk. But it took my friend another 6 months of nagging to make me go to a festival, which I enjoyed very much. If I'd known what a puja was, and if I'd not been stuck in the middle of the audience, I would have run a mile. And I was stuck there when they started to do this thing. Up to then, it had been very straightforward. Suddenly, I was with Mandara, Blue Lotus. Where are we? But by the end of the puja, something had happened, and the atmosphere, the buzz in the room, which was another hired hall. Sangharakshita gave a very short talk, but there was something about the evening, and I was kind of a bit, hadn't really made plans for the summer. I was still recovering from a heartbreak, and I saw an advert for the summer retreat. So I thought, what the hell? Signed up for it. And on the retreat, I suppose that side of Bhante that very hard to put across, you know, because there was something about him, in a way, it was quite strange. But, you know, when you heard him talk, when he answered questions, it just came from such relaxed depth. You know, he obviously embodied, he knew what he was talking about technically, and he could so impress you with the breadth of his Dharma knowledge, all traditions, Western literature, Persian philosophy, Egyptian. You know, it was just a light show of imagery and connection. And yet this rather strange man at the heart of it, that if you ask a question of him, you've got this amazing shower of depth And if you know, just a few times I'd get the table with him, and just the way he could talk about something, it was like, you know, without being old, you know, even though he was twice, at least twice my age at the time. Yeah, he was so obviously the grown up, but not in terms of age, just in terms of you had to. It was worth listening to. It was worth getting out of the way and listening to. Just if I could put my own opinions aside, my own desire to impress aside, just to be around him, there was something very substantial, just transmitting and challenging. Meanwhile, you know, the surroundings were skillful until in those early years, it was really almost person by person getting involved. And then gradually people getting ordained because the first ordinations had been important, but perhaps they hadn't stuck in the way he expected, and he was quite cautious. So he kind of over the next 2 years, you know, he ordained very few people, and then, you know, the end of 73 to 74, there was a lot of this.
So in terms of you talked about encountering, is there a point where you feel you got close to him on a one-to-one basis? So basic friendship, or did that grow very gradually? In particular, I don't know, a particular instance which felt you more personal.
Yeah, I'd say it was gradual and it was over time. He was always available. I mean, just for example, when we were looking for a new centre for our activities, this old piano warehouse that we've been using in Archway, London, it was all due for redevelopment. So we were raising money and looking for a new place, which eventually would become the London Buddhist Centre. And we were on our way. Mitra was driving Bhante, me, and I can't remember who, that had just been Bhante and me, across to Bethnal Green to have a look at this burnt out fire station. In fact, it was the first time Bhante and I were going to see it. And Bhante was going to ordain somebody, a good friend of mine, sometime quite soon. And on the way over, I started to very presumptuously challenge Bhante. You know, are you sure he's ready? And she's in the front seat and we're in this little Citroen Diane. And he sort of turned around and said, oh. And I said, I'm not sure. He spun around in the chair and said, but if you think that, you really must tell him. And it was, you know, this wasn't a moment of, you know, warm intimacy, but it was suddenly, we were out of the distance. I was as involved as him for that instant. Well, that's what he was pulling on. I think, you know, when you wrote somewhere about your questions of incidents, I remember. You know, I remember that. Funnily enough, one of those moments when my connection with him became stronger, even more personal. I had suddenly, you know, I had skin in the game. Or another occasion, I was in the community just outside Croydon, which became the Croydon Centre, and we were getting that going. And Bhante stayed with us for a few days while running a seminar upstairs for some women, a study seminar for some women. But in the evenings, you know, after dinner, he and I chatting. And I remember him just talking about India, something about India, about Mrs. Gandhi and how she acted during the emergency, locking up her opponents and so on. Telling these stories, and I looked at him and just saw an energy. He was only talking about India, it wasn't nothing magical happening, but I honestly for a moment thought, is he mad? There was an energy behind those eyes which I'd not seen before. A kind of enthusiasm, almost childlike, which coming from him, which often is so distant, was just quite exciting and almost unnerving to witness. So I remember incidents like that where I kind of felt I was getting closer to him and where he was letting me in. But I think because I very early started working on publishing this stuff and also involved in running centres, what became the London Buddhist Centre, but before that, along with some very good colleagues getting the Croydon Centre going. But particularly because I was publishing his books and his pamphlets and he was getting stuff done. There was a sort of, it wasn't a barrier. It wasn't a distance. He really sort of valued what I was doing. It was very important to me. And he was always available to me. I had personal questions. But there was a way in which I never became, if you like, an intimate. I mean, Subhuti has spoken about this, and I mentioned this, I think, in my book, that from my angle on the same thing, that the way Subhuti tells the story is that Bhante once said to him, there are people who I get very close to as friends, and there are the people I work very closely with, and they're not always the same. And so, in a way, yes, I was very close with Bhante, working with him for close to 30, 40 years, publishing, traveling India, and so on. But, I wouldn't want to sort of say, well, I was one of his really close buddies, intimates. His close buddies, were often the more rebellious ones. They were the people who were not quite so in awe of him, who could just treat him, from the point of view of people like me, quite disrespectfully. But he kind of, well, I once put it to him that his closest buddies within our Sangha seemed to be the more rebellious people. He thought about it, he said, well, I just like to be with people who can let me be myself. And it's not that we didn't let him be himself, but we just, we probably all know what that means. That was just a way, I guess, he could sometimes not always be having to deal with people's projections. I mean, thinking the weight of that is on him.
It sounds like sometimes you might feel hemmed in by that. So just to be able to let go.
I mean, he sort of, on the one hand, he saw through it and never played to it. On the other hand, it can be tiresome.
Now, moving on slightly, is moving into reading a bit of your book. I was kind of interested in this. Well, it sounds like Bhante didn't have it all worked out, and then just saying you need to do this. You were talking about being, I think it was a first order bench sitting in the community in Croydon. I'm just interested in that, how he worked. It's not, is it? It sounded like you were involved in something with him, but together. I was just interested in how that worked. Whether he was the inspiration, but maybe not so much the detail.
Well, in terms of the Dharma, he had it all. In terms of the evolution of a community, of a movement, he was very much behind everything and attentive to the details. I mean, he would claim to read the minutes of every institution that we founded at least twice, and he'd be on to the phone to you. So if he read something, or he would in lectures or in seminars refer to something he'd read in the minutes which pleased him or upset him or worried him. He was very much on in terms of having things that a movement mapped out. Well, that's a whole question. If you look at the arc of his life, in a way, I think Triratna, in a way, with the appropriate conditions, was inevitable. when he wrote at the age of 18, the article, The Unity of Buddhism, which is his first published article in the Middle Way, the magazine of the London Buddhist Society, which had a kind of global reach. He was 18 years old. And he was telling the Buddhist world, particularly the Western Buddhist world, that they were not in a position to understand Buddhism. Most people hadn't read enough of it and weren't aware of the breadth and depth of the total tradition of all the schools, all the sects. But nor were they that neurologically predisposed, thanks to the conditioning as a Western, to understand what Buddhism was saying, how different it was from a theistic religion, how different it was to conventional Western understanding of what a religion means, because Judeo-Christian tradition is so steeped in, well, all the myths in a way have become history and therefore got completely corrupted. But as that poem demonstrated, where Bhante talks about he's going to find the true path himself and sit by the still pool, but cut through all the corruption, the thorns, I can't remember the words. He's alluding there to even his understanding of the wider Buddhist world as he'd met it in the East. He knew from the age of 18 and then through his life again and again and again that although he never questioned Buddhism as the map, the best map he found that spoke to the essence of what he thought it was about, it being ineffable. But if you want a map, you can't do better than Buddhism, even though he took inspiration from everyone. But sooner or later, he was going to have to let rip and see if it could be built new from the ground up. And he engaged us in that project. I mean, on the one hand, all people like me, but I read a bit. And there was a lot of people who read nothing, they just come to a meditation class or something. I mean, most of the time we just thought, well, he is Buddhism. We didn't, it took a while to realize this is a project. He's engaging us in, a really profound project. I think we kind of got that, even though we were young and stupid and naive, so we kind of got it. But he'd been hatching and hatching the urge to do it, almost all his life, from probably the experience at the age of 16. And we were aware of that, and he did engage us in it, and he had to deal with us, because we were all he had. And as you say, it's still very young and very new. We'll come on to that in the future.
Well, in a way, you started to explore something that I was really keen to ask you. Even now, I don't think I really appreciate how momentous it is. It's not just to start a new movement, a whole new tradition. It's not just we'll develop this within the Tibetan tradition or a school within the Theravada. It's a whole new tradition. And in a way, I suppose I'm interested, you've started to draw out what were the factors that made Bhante realise the factors that brought that, that he decided to do that. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking, classically there's the stories, when he is told English Sangha Trust don't want him to come return. Yeah. And he says, he talks to Terry, doesn't he? He's from Terry. Do you know what this means?
Yes.
Yes. So you could look at it within that narrow sphere, but in a way there seem to be a lot more factors. You also touch on, if he stayed in India, would he have been happy to practice in another tradition?
Yeah, well, you see, bear in mind, even in India, he founded the Triratna Buddhist Order, the monastery, whatever you want to say, of the three ways, of the three dharmas. So would he have been happy? I mean, when I once asked him, we were in India at the time, and I asked him what he would have done had he not come to the West. And he said, well, I would have probably devoted my life to meditation, writing poetry, and books on Buddhist metaphysics. he didn't say I would have moved into a Theravada monastery or lived with Tibetans. I mean, if you think about his journey, he took inspiration, from Hindu swamis, Ramana Maharshi, and Ramdas and Ananda Mahima, and other swamis who he met near the barracks. And then, from Buddhists he met as he traveled through Calcutta, Singapore, Sri Lanka. Occasionally he'd meet a Buddhist who inspired him. Often as not, he met Buddhists who did the opposite. I mean, I think, and then, well, the evidence is so obvious. He took Theravada ordination. He wanted to be ordained as a monk, but what he actually wanted was to honor the sort of renunciate aspect of the going forth dimension of his life. And being a Theravada monk was sort of what he assumed, understandably, that was the way you did it. But how long was it that he was with Jagdishvaja before he was in Kalimpong? Completely happy among Tibetans, Mr. Chen, Chinese, Chan Yogi. He never felt fidelity to any limited version. And partly because, as he once said to me, if anything could have put me off Buddhism, it would have been the Buddhist time. He said that very seriously. So I mean, there was quite a lot of disillusion, but it was more than that. And I think it's quite hard to grasp, but it's just a strange story, and I don't know what to make of it. Because I can't remember myself far enough back to really assess if I'm on the right track. But quite early on, but Sangharakshita was living in Sukhavati community at the time in his flat, along the Buddhist Center. So it would put us into probably the very early 80s, around 1980, early days. I was wrestling for some reason, obviously heard the Bodhisattva Ideal series by then probably a few times, and this thing about the relative and absolute bodhicitta was on my mind, and I was probably in a very naive way trying to talk to Bhante, sitting in his flat with him, trying to put into words what I thought I'd worked out. But it was probably very vague and non-dual and a bit woolly. And he gave me quite serious attention and paused and said, well, there's always the question of fidelity to the tradition. And I sort of, that's come back. In a way I do, in a way, I say this with all sort of humility, because maybe I don't remember clearly what was going on. And I certainly maybe didn't penetrate what he meant, but I have this sense of Bhante of realizing that the project is bigger than Buddhism, but you've got to have an anchor. You've got to have a map. You've got to have a raft. And if you're going to have a map and a raft, really be sure you know what you're doing with it. Don't play with it. Don't think you can fudge the edges and bring in your own woolly ideas. So it was a kind of, it was to say, well, be careful, hang on, what? Shall we talk the language of Buddhism? And I feel that's his relationship. I was reading just the other day the White Lotus Sutra series in their book, the publishers of the Dharma in the talk, in the chapter on the parable of the rain cloud, towards the end of that chapter, there's a very interesting couple of paragraphs when he's talking about, on the one hand, there's growth, and on the other hand, there's the sun and the rain. There's what inspires and guides. And he just goes off on a riff about, well, obviously it's the Dharma. We're talking about the Dharma. But he then sort of suggests that people in the West are so, young people particularly, he's got in mind, have become cynical about religion. Religion has let them down for one reason or another. They've left it. And in a way, the last thing they want to hear about is maybe religion. Then he just speculates And maybe, in the West, Buddhism is going to appear in secular clothes or something like that. And his mind was that broad that what matters, that in his life, he's already, it is his job to give us the map, the kind of total map of the Dharma, so that we could make use of that as our basis, but also an angle of approach to that map, which was very respectful, but also broad enough to really mine its riches and work out for ourselves what helps. But somewhere the project, and in some ways Bhante, is kind of bigger than that.
It's really fascinating to hear that. I mean, just a few different elements that come out of that. Maybe you might think about it a bit more. One is that sort of fidelity to the tradition, not just out of conservatism, but actually seeing and experiencing that you need a framework in which to practice. You need you need to be within a tradition to some extent. So there was that fidelity you talked about. There's something about his own personal integrity, which maybe connects with what you were saying about there's a larger project in Buddhism. And I don't know, there's a third thing that comes to mind, is the bodhisattva idea. And maybe in particular, I was just thinking about, Bhante's connection in India, particularly the ex-untouchables, Ambedkar's followers, where that was an element that as well that came in to influencing, yes, I need to start, even though this is going to be incredibly difficult, but this is what is needed. I don't know whether
a few elements in that.
sorry, it's too much.
Well, we'll come to India, not separately, but I'll see where I go. You mentioned the bodhisattva idea, and again, going back to the White Lotus, the parable of the rain cloud. The Buddha, the parable has the old man luring his children who are just lost in their play away from the burning house by tempting them out with three different kinds of cart. One drawn by an ox, one drawn by maybe a horse, and one by a deer. And different carts appeal to different kids. One way or the other, he gets them out. And then they all discover they're only being offered the one cart, which is the glorious one with all the canopies and the jewels and the rest. But there's still this question, was the old man lying? And therefore, is the Buddha lying? Because after all, there are all these different traditions and there are these different levels. So it's already all these people moved out on the Buddha just prior with him, giving them this kind of teaching of skillful means. That the real aim of the spiritual life is to attain supreme Buddhahood and cultivate through lifetimes the skillful means to take other people there. The Buddha says the old man wasn't lying because all these things, like the other carts, they were real carts, they were good carts. It's just this one was better. So he makes it clear he's not being political. The sutra is not saying, well, really the Mahayana is the best and the only way. Well, in a way it is, but all these other ways that have been worked out by people, they have their value because some people aren't ready to be told about supreme enlightenment. And I think somewhere in there I connect with Bhante and his willingness to offer us all these carts. Because he was in a position from his scholarship, and all of it filtered through the sort of, for him, the sort of touchstone of that experience he had and had deepened over the years. His own sort of thread of connection with the heart of the matter in enlightenment, something ineffable. But that was the filter through which he had been able to make his own synthesis for himself. His job then, he saw, was to offer us the means to do a synthesis, but he did more than that. He also offered us a sort of map to the maps. You know, and so when you talk about Bhante deciding to start a new tradition, that's important, because he didn't just say, here it is, and now I'm off. You know, he says, here it is, and there are certain principles, you know, that are really important to follow as you kind of, you know, approach this enormously broad world of the Buddha Dharma. You know, and that's what he tried to convey through his talks and his writings and his seminars. How do we approach this total body of teachings as an institution and as individuals in ways where we make real use of them, or they really serve us rather than distracting us? It's incredibly delicate work. You know, and because in the story, the parable, you know, the disciples immediately were very happy with their cup, their wonderful cup. You know, we're still very sort of spiritually finding our way. But you know, he's, you know, it's to the essence of what he tried to do in all those years, was to introduce the modern world to all the riches, all these different ways in which people of all kinds of temperament and background could approach. You know, it's well, in a way, to say gold, you know, it is a goal, but in a way, it could just, as he preferred to say, evolve. That's a whole other subject. I don't know if that's very clear, but I'm trying to get something across to. I remember there was a period when, yes, one of the centres I was a president of, one of the times Bhante and I disagreed and I was right. They invited, or they accepted an offer from one of Thich Nhat Hanh's nuns, an English woman, to run a weekend in their centre. And she did, but at the end of it, she did this ceremony, which Bhante Deva Mitra, who just passed through meeting at the time, you know, both felt kind of almost tantamount to taking a kind of ordination from someone else. So it became a big deal, and I was the president of the European Centre. I said to Bhante before it, "Are you sure it's a good idea?" He said, "Well, I'm sure they'll be okay," and they weren't. It became extremely difficult. Where was I going with that?
You were saying there's subtleties with the.
Well, yes, yeah. The nun in question wrote to the one in the retreat, and basically said, "Well, Sangharakshita had lots of teachers, you know what?" And it was you know, it was the kind of accusation that sometimes people would and will, you know. It's not that Bhante didn't think people should take inspiration from other traditions, or even if he trusted them from the teachers, but you know, and this is something that was very obvious to us at the time. He really kind of knew the whole thing. We could kind of trust the evidence of him, who and what he was, that he knew what he was talking about when he encouraged us to accept him as our guide to this world. You know, and through all his talks and his seminars and his teachings, I think it was very obvious to us being there with him. You know, the talks were fresh, and there wasn't much else going on anyway in England or in the West. So it was very automatic and easy to just think, well, he knows what he's talking about. He is our guide. Almost without realizing what a gift he was handing us, of trying to give us, of finding a way of being present to the project, to the journey, while accepting inspiration from other sources. Very delicate work, and I think this is why you know, the Mitra course and the ordination courses are what they are. You know, they are effectively courses in Sangharakshita Dharma. But it's not so much Sangharakshita Dharma, it's Sangharakshita map to the Dharma. But it's delicate work, and as time goes by, and as you know, Free Buddhist Audio produces thousands of talks by different order members, and there are other teachers. Very interesting talk with a guy who's now a Mitra, maybe getting close to ordination. About maybe a year or two ago, we were talking. He'd been involved with a little group in Stroud for a year or two. And during the course of a coffee, I mentioned one of Sangharakshita's talks. And he said, oh, yeah, do you think they are worth listening to? That's what it looks like these days. Gosh, just one of the speakers. Yeah, one of the talks. I mean, it really shocked me, but it also really interested me. I couldn't blame him. It wasn't his fault. It was ours. But I think the project of understanding what Bhante was trying to hand us while practicing, it in a more and more diverse community, a more and more diverse Buddhist world. It's going to be really delicate work into the future, because it is something at the core of it. Someone had to do. And it's really only just begun.
Maybe I'll just say at this point, we have after the tea break, opportunity for questions. If anyone has any questions. So maybe if you do have any questions coming in, what you may be saying, good to just make a mental note while we have it.
Ask about India.
Well, I did. That's where I wanted to go actually. A little bit next to say, we'll just bring in. You went with him to India, didn't you? That must have really, you saw a bit more directly what India meant to him, and what he meant to the people in India.
Well, I was something that struck me quite recently, because I was involved in a Mitra group again in Stroud, where they've been studying the white the super golden light. And I really I'm sure you know the super golden light, and he often refers to Hindu deities and draws in the stories and the richness and the interpretation out of the Hindu life. And I thought, hang on, we gave those talks, I think, in 1978. 79, 78, 69. We were building London Buddhism. And of course, that was the same time when Mitra went to India, made contact. He went to yoga, and made contact with some of his friends, discovered that for himself, the substance and energy and vastness of this opportunity to do something in India, and came back, and after a while decided, that he would try and start something in India. And if I think back to those lectures, I realized Bhante must have been so excited to know that his work, the work that he'd done, among doctrine lectures, Buddhist followers, was going to be continued. He'd always hoped it would. But if you see a hardback edition of The Three Jewels, which was published by Heinemann in about 1970, on the fly leaf of the cover of the hardback, it says, from now on, Sangharakshita plans to divide his time between England and India, which, something, well, in a way he did, but obviously he was never going to be able to do what was needed. So to be able to take up, the opportunity and the challenge and the scope that Dr. Ambedkar had opened up through his own conversion to Buddhism and encouraging his followers to convert. And as with all these traditions, it was already becoming diverse, scattered, corrupted. Could have come to nothing. But I think for Sangharakshita it was really important because he really felt for that movement, the movement of mass conversion, the movement of the uplift of the Dalit community through the practice and the values of the Dharma, not just for them, but not just for the total Dalit world, but even for the spiritual and psychological health of India. And I think Bhante's project and Dr. Ambedkar's project was not just for the betterment of the Dalit community. I think Ambedkar's vision was that something had to cure the sickness of India. And yes, a few million people, potentially 100 million, I think there were 100 getting on for maybe not 100 million in 1956, but many tens of millions of so-called untouchables, people, and converting to Buddhism, practicing Buddhism would be like dropping a seed into the entire nation, which could explode in who knew what, but through the individual work of practicing Buddhists, not through just a religion. If we wanted to do that, Islam would be a much better bet. So I think Bhante saw it as an extremely exciting and heart-moving project for us, building our world, a little world within our world, new society. It was just such a valuable sort of echo. We were participating in that, and we could go to India and talk about what we'd done. We could come back from India and tell people about how Buddhism could be seen as a revolutionary force. It was a wonderful symbiosis. Is a wonderful symbiosis. And Bhante in India, well, Loka Mitra committed me to go. Well, by asking me to come out with Bhante for that trip. A year before that, in a talk I think in Worli, a locality within Mumbai, had told people, Loka Mitra sent people on the telegram saying, Sangharakshita just in front of 7,000 people committed you to coming to India to write the book. Dr. Ambedkar and the Buddhist Revolution. But then, a year or two later, Loka Mitra said, look, come on with Bhante, take photographs. And I thought, wow, I'm going to see Bhante in India. He's going to be a completely different person. Sort of the Indian Bhante, not this rather reserved English person. But he was the same Bhante. Very mindful, very self-possessed, very focused. I mean, he totally was at home there. Spoke sufficient Hindi to be able to talk to people. He understood, spoke the language of, Ambedkarite, socially oriented, community oriented Dharma, absolutely fluently, moved people. It was wonderful to see him at work, but Bhante in between. I was expecting to get photographs like no one had got before. Never got. Bhante being mindful, being self-possessed. Coming back from a talk where there'd been hundreds of garlands and loudspeakers and devotees, just back to where we were staying, very calm, having a cup of cocoa, going to bed. Absolutely serious about what he was doing. No lack of commitment or enthusiasm. It just didn't express itself crudely or scattered. I hope to see a wild Bhante. So the wildness is on a much deeper level.
So many big questions beyond that. I wanted to ask you maybe a little bit of a different practice, whether you were saying how your relationship with Bhante has developed through the years. And maybe I don't know a bit about, you regard yourself, use the word disciple, discipleship.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was, and it's interesting reading something, somebody, an academic, a really lovely lady I know from my work in America, but she taught at McGill in Montreal and now is a professor somewhere else. I found, completely by accident, I stumbled on a little review or something she wrote about this book. And said what comes across above all is Nagabodhi's love for Sangharakshita. And that was really interesting to me because my relationship with Bhante, for the reasons I've already mentioned, to do with working for him, and I really did pick the kind of ground zero of his worry zone. He confessed in a couple of talks or interviews himself that he was a worrier. By nature, he'd inherited from his mother a personality that could worry. And it didn't show very often outside, but when it came to the sort of innumerable deadlines that publishing one of his books in the days before computers were involved, deadline after deadline after deadline, and he'd be on top of it. And in a way, the nature of our friendship, but I was living with him at Marchmoor and at Patton over the years, and had a lot to do with him. And when I lived in Sheffield for 6 years, he was on the phone almost every day, but always at dinner time. And one day, after about 2 years, and I said, Bhante, you do realise this is when we're having our community dinner? He said, well, I know. This is when I know I can get hold of you. And it's somewhere between slippery and smooth. And I'd been in London for a week or two working with the guys at what was called Windhorse Associates, a graphic design studio we had in those early days of scalpels and cowgun, galley proofs. All that, and I'd spend a couple of weeks getting our magazines out, and I'd come back from London, having done this work, and Bhante at lunch would say, "Oh, where have you slunk back from?" He just had his way with this. He was kind of teasing and nice, and there was a lot, but also there was, really, he gave me quite a, he kept me on the boat, and sadly, it hadn't occurred to me. I did once say to him, that I realized that the way he treated me and the way he could have related to me through the work was just because he cared so deeply. And, he agreed and sort of appreciated, and I felt pleased to have said that, because it was a way of saying, this hurts sometimes, that teaching Martin, but I was saying it in a good way. But it was when Bhante was living at Adistana, he just moved in, and if people remember that, or people who don't know, he had just had something like a year of almost crippling sleep deprivation, insomnia, his second bout over a period of years, and hadn't seen anyone, hadn't wanted to see anyone, just lived really quietly in his new flat at Adistana. And I can't remember what mood I was in, but I was at a meeting, sort of meeting of, I think it was probably the Odeon Sangharakshita Trust or something. But a group of us were sitting in one of the rooms looking out on a building site. And I was feeling in some reason quite under the cosh with Bhante, can't remember why. But Mahamati was talking about conversations he had with Bhante, because Mahamati was very close with Bhante through that period. Often would sort of just sleep on the floor next to Bhante, so that Bhante knew there was someone there. He was just, and Mahamati just used this word, warrior. He said, he said that Bhante had said to him the night before that he was by natural disposition of an anxious nature. it had never occurred to me in a way, after all those years, like there was a kind of a thread of a projection that had never allowed myself to see that what Bhante was doing to me was often coming from there. And it exploded in my head with a feeling of love and relief towards him, and a feeling of personal liberation. Went off to lunch in this sort of mood, like I sort of had a major experience with certain. Came back to the meeting, and we all gathered. I mean, we're just going to get into quite an interesting and gritty bit of gossip. When there was a knock on the door, and he was paranoid. Said, "No, Nagabodhi, Bhante would like to see you." Amazing. He hadn't asked to see anyone, but because he knew I'd be living somewhere. And I think for that reason, I don't know, but it was like the most astonishing piece of serendipity. But it was actually in the wake of that moment of just seeing Bhante in a new way. So I think being around Bhante could be terribly challenging, always rewarding, instructive, and often he could tease. He had a great sense of humor, but also you could sit at meals while after the silent meal, he would then relax and talk about a biography by someone you never heard of, about a poet you'd never heard of, in an era you weren't interested in. I mean, that sort of thing could drive some of us mad, apart from Vikrapani. His first degree from Cambridge. And also, I'm very happy to say my relationship with Bhante, was quite personal. It was very constant, and it was quite complex. But I think he saw me quite clearly, and I didn't always find that comfortable. But I think he gave me a tremendous amount, and at the same time, I think in some ways, writing the book, would have been quite difficult to have me for that experience, the Mahabharati experience. But I think in writing the book, and I think Vanessa, this woman who wrote that review, she's right. And I think, in the end, yes, I am a disciple. And my life shows I'm a disciple. But in terms of a personal feeling of discipleship rooted, in the wavelength of love, yes. But it wasn't always easy. But I mean, an extraordinary experience. I mean, I say in another book, in Jai Bhim, that because working at the BBC, even in the humble sort of as an assistant editor, I was just starting my career. I met interesting people, successful people, famous people, over lunch. But what was it about this man that I'd give all that up to do that? And I wrote in Jai Bhim that that he was the only person of whom I could say without any doubt that he was happy. I sort of rereading that recently, kind of revising it for maybe seeing it out again. I think I might have changed it to content. And I think he was, I think he was happy, but there was another way in which he was always, wanting more. But I think he was absolutely grounded in himself. The anxiety thing, the worry thing, it was a personality trait. I don't think it went deeper than that. It wasn't an existential worry. It wasn't existential. Yes, his temperament, just as he could tease and laugh, so he could worry. And I don't know that the insomnia was related to worry. I'm not sure that it was. I think it just hits some people that way, there are people who have theories it was a nervous breakdown, it was guilt about the naughty things he did. I think it was just an affliction that came very, very painfully. But yeah, I mean, I in a way, I feel more and more my sort of emotional response to it, the warmth of my emotional response grows with time.
In a way, I probably answered my last question. I know it's sort of coming into you right now. Because in a way you've unfolded. I can ask how your relationship has, since he's passed away, 6 years. I mean, because in a way, is that change? Is that unfolded?
Well, I think that, is what I've said, and I think writing the book has really been important for me. And I don't know how well I've communicated it today, but I get a lot of positive feedback. So far, only positive feedback. And often what people say is it really was important. And this leaves me people who think they already know it, they've read them. But to experience, as it were, the whole arc of Bhante's life, to be able to have, as it were, in a bottle, that fidelity to that project, on all those levels, it's quite mind-blowing. And I think my understanding or my grasp, I won't say I understand it, but my grasp of what he was about, has not even when I wrote it, but when I read it. Wow. I think, well, I can't believe how much I got into it. But when I look at what he actually presents, this man, good grief. I think that's pretty grateful. Very grateful for the work. I'm glad that other people seem to. But yes, and I think that's been, for me, it's been an important part of my journey. Of feeling close to him and feeling a disciple. Still leaves me alone with my project, my life. No, it's pretty chill, but yeah. Well, no, I mean, not alone because there are other books. There's all that guidance, and there's this community. It's a wonderful bunch of people sharing and deepening and continuing.
Well, I think I'm going to suggest that's a good place for us to stop for now.